tō mātou matua I te rangi, kia tapu tau ingoa. Kia tai mai tō rangatiratanga, kia mea te atau e whaia ki runga ki te whenua, kia rite anō ki tō te rangi. And then it strums. O mai kia mātou aia nei, e taro mō mātou mō te e nei rā. Urua o mātou hara, me mātou hoki e muru nei. Then it goes up. I o te honga e hara ana ki a mātou. Aua hoki mātou e kawea, kia whakawaia. Engari whakaorania, kia I te kino, nau hoki te ranga tiratanga, te kaha me te kororia.
Welcome to this third session of OBSA 2021. It's good to start with Lord's Prayer, in which it was sung outside of the meeting hall. So that's one of the elements that we have been talking about, that we need to listen to what happens in our communities. But also it's a wahine teaching tane, the words and the rhythms. Another element that's missing from the way we do biblical studies in Oceania. We've had two sessions talking about the sins of biblical studies and the unfinished businesses of biblical studies. And today we look forward, we look ahead to the future of biblical studies. Our four speakers, I'll name them and they can introduce themselves in the appropriate and cultural ways. Vaitusi Nofoainga, and Aotearoa, Rountree, Eseta, Mateiviti-Tulavu, and Paul Reynolds. So welcome to our speakers and welcome to you who are present on Zoom. Malua Vaitusi.
Alofa. Talofa lava to everyone who can join us in discussing the future of biblical studies in Oceania this evening. It is great to see the faces of the scholars whose works and writings I cherish. The future of biblical studies in Oceania is a vast topic. Speaking from my experience of doing and teaching and learning biblical studies in Samoa, and witnessing our people, such as members of our church, doing and learning biblical studies in our theological college and our Bible school in our communities, I believe that the future of biblical studies in Oceania is in good shape, good status. However, it is essential to talk about some issues we have encountered and continue to face in doing, teaching, and learning biblical studies in Oceania. It is to give us awareness so that we can learn more about these issues and how to deal with them, to make sure that we continue trying our best from our fields to serve God. John Hervé, Monica, and Mark Brett have already written about this topic, and some of their thoughts will be mentioned in this short presentation. The first point I want to talk about is method. Professor Mailo mentioned in his talk about the sins of biblical studies in Oceania, method as a sin, and I agree. A method of interpretation has been and is still one of the issues in biblical studies. And as we all know, any method has limitations. The debate on what is the best and most appropriate method to interpret the Bible continues. We know that how to use a method in biblical interpretation of a text determines the final interpretation. And I will mention some of the reasons why that happens. Firstly, any method used in any biblical interpretation always comes with presuppositions of the interpreter. Secondly, a method uses a limited number of analytic strategies to reach a conclusion that is superior to the use of other analytical strategies of another method. The goal of a method is to exclude the analytical strategies of another method by using superior strategies for reaching a particular desired and limited goal. The philosophy of a method is grounded in a belief that the true nature of something is in something itself. It is a philosophy of essence or substance as reflected in the use of the historical critical method. I am not saying that we shall abandon the use of methods in biblical studies in Oceania. In fact, methods such as the historical critical method are here to stay. They are significant to our doing, teaching, and learning biblical studies. However, how we use them is the point that I want to emphasize. And I will just briefly touch on the suggestions on how to use the traditional methods, such as the historical critical methods in Oceania. Any tradition that is not subject to changes is not a tradition. So traditional methods we have been using and we are still using in biblical studies, such as the historical critical method, is subject to changes. And the change that I am suggesting is not changing the method, but how it is used with other methods and approaches. And in this way, the use of methods will be grounded in the belief that the true nature of something is exhibited in the way it relates to all other things. The goal, therefore, is not you are included on my terms, but instead you are included on your terms. It is where we take advantage of the benefits of integration or a blending of the classical, modern, and postmodern approaches to biblical studies. The blending approaches is not new. It is one of the ways used in the early Christians' discovery of the gospel and is embedded in the language of the gospel as told and shown by the writers of the New Testament, such as conceptual blending concerning a particular space and place, etc. This approach is actually what we are exercising and doing now in our studies of the Bible in Oceania. The other point I want to talk about concerning the future of biblical studies in Oceania is biblical studies in the curriculum. It is essential that our inclusion of biblical studies in the college, theological college, or Bible school curriculum must consider the following views of seeing the Bible: the functional view, the canonical view, the historical view, the ecclesiological view, and of course, the oceanic view in relation to ethnic studies, women's studies, Pacific studies. I think that Pacific studies should now consider in university biblical and theological studies from Oceania in their curriculum. The other point I want to raise is that from my experience from these years I have worked here in Malua, I have realized that the future of biblical studies in Samoa and in Oceania is in its connection to the work of the church. As a New Testament reader, behind the canonization of the Bible, such as the canonization of the New Testament, is the importance of the work of the church. Not only the beginning of the work of the church, but also its work later on. For example, the work of the disciples that began in Galilee. And Jesus in his resurrection wanted his disciples to return to Galilee, where everything started. So in other words, what I mean is that the future of biblical studies is in the localization of biblical studies. And this point is mentioned by Yonder in his article about the future of biblical studies as in drifting and undrifting in the Pacific. Localization in a sense of considering important our people's or members of our church understanding of the Bible in relation to their island way of living life. This shows that biblical studies need to explore that discipleship now in our local context, which I call a reproclamation of the gospel to our people who have already learned and live that gospel. For example, is re-discipleship in relation to the issue of women in conjunction with the patriarchal language of the Bible, such as the New Testament, as raised by Aotearoa last Sunday. And we will find that, as Michael Foucault said, where there is power, there is resistance. Power always simultaneously undoes itself from within, because there is no outside from which to resist. And what this means is that the Bible is neither essentially oppressive nor liberatory. Its meanings are socially constructed and therefore subject to change. Another point, the future of biblical studies in Oceania relies on the importance of the consideration in the teaching, doing, and learning biblical studies in our theological colleges, the learning of Greek and Hebrew languages. Learning the Greek and Hebrew languages are very important. The New Testament is the Christian interpretation of the Hebrew scripture. Intertextual study of the New Testament and Old Testament will give me as a reader more understanding of that Christian interpretation, which is why the learning of Hebrew and Greek is important. In relation to the Samoan translation of the Bible, our elders who translated the Bible using their understanding and knowledge of the Hebrew and Greek languages, and is reflected in the Samoan translation version of the Bible. For example, some of the words in the Samoan Bible are transliterations of the Greek words such as artos for areto, Christos for keriso, etc. It is also important to learn the Greek from the New Testament reader point of view to broaden an understanding of a text by the use of understanding of some parts of the language that are unique in Greek koine. For example, is the use of the middle voice and the verbal adjectives. All these reasons suggest the importance of learning Greek and Hebrew. The other point I want to make about the future of biblical studies in Oceania is the use of our languages in our writings and publication on biblical studies. This is important, and it is something that we all need to work on, as mentioned by Professor Mailo in his interpretation, in his presentation. Our people want to know what we think from biblical studies point of view of issues happening in our worlds. And using our own languages will communicate what we think from biblical studies point of view about any issues in regard to what is happening in our communities. This is important. And another point I want to make is, it is also important for the future of biblical studies, the bringing together of biblical theology and dogmatic and systematic theology in a way that makes sense the reality of life we live in our spaces and places in Oceania. It is more important to remember that our ministry should reflect what we learn and teach in biblical studies. Our biblical studies should not cause conflicts in our communities and in the world, but to preach peace. Therefore, public theology so far is doing a very good job to encourage and to go about dealing and solving some of the issues in the public. And the last point I want to make is, we need to encourage our students in the Pacific and Oceania to use our works. Overall, I suggest that the future of biblical studies is in good shape and in good hands. And we just need to continue on the work we are doing with an inclusion of more young people in this circle. And also, we need to continue bridging the gap in biblical studies between us in our fields, scholars, and our people in our church. And in doing so, and this is from my experience, the members of our church want to learn more about the authors and their intentions, which is very interesting, as embedded in the language of the text. Thus, the historical critical method is here to stay. Thank you, Johnny.
Malo
That's all I
bito,
want to say for now.
malo bito whaftainasi purekorisi.
Yeah.
It's great that you've also answered several of the questions from the last 2 weeks. So that's very much appreciated. We'll come back during the Talanoa time, but we'll move on now to our next speaker, Aotearoa, Rountree.
Kia ora tātai, ngā mihi anō kia tātai kua hui hui mai nei I tēnei pō, tēnei te mihi atu kia koutou katoa ngā kaiwhakahaere, me ngā whanaunga no ngā haue whā, tēnei te mihi atu kia tātou katoa. Ko te aroha rā kia koutou ko mahu nei te ao Rountree tōku ingoa, he uri ahau no ngā puhi. Nō reira tēnei te mihi. Greetings to everybody from the four corners of the world. Greetings to everybody. My name is Aotearoa and I'm from Ngāpuhi in the far north of the center of the universe, Aotearoa. Just before I share a kind of reflection, really, I was saying to Sione, I'm not sure if I've really qualified to speak in this space. I've not studied biblical studies before. I've not taught biblical studies before. And so I'm not sure that this is really my tribe here, whānau. So what I'm sharing today is basically my experiences and my people's experiences in terms of biblical studies, and so just some thoughts really about potentially what the future might look like, particularly for us as Māori in terms of biblical studies. So I'm just calling these thoughts or he whakaroro Māori, a kind of Māori reflection. And I'm talking here mainly about kind of the relocating of biblical studies. So, yeah, so here we go. So biblical studies as an academic discipline, I think, has been institutionalized to the point where it has become unrecognizable to the naked eyes and ears of our flax roots people, our Pakiaka communities. In many ways, we have allowed ourselves to institutionalize the Bible away from the people and places it was meant to engage and serve. We justify this shift by claiming a special, maybe even a sacred right of access for the privileged few, those who have the capacity to enter our institutions and engage in our biblical studies offerings, who are largely deemed worthy and able to train for ordained ministry. We've often perpetuated the ideology that reveres the Bible in Oceania, setting it apart from humanity rather than using it as a tool that guides us to our Creator God. Yet when our flax roots people, our tupuna, our ancestors, first encountered the text in our own languages, at least in Aotearoa, they would critique and debate and kind of Māorify the Bible for their own means. They would give explanation and interpretation from a Māori or tangata whenua worldview. It became a pastime, an everyday, living, breathing part of our being. So our tupuna would even chastise the Pākehā missionaries for their contradictory lifestyles or realities that did not always follow their own biblical teachings. Like most of us who've been colonised and or institutionalised by academia, there exists a measure of elitism within the discipline that continues to elevate, preference and privilege Pākehā Western biblical scholarship. We have allowed our biblical studies of Oceania to be pushed to the margins or the fringes of the discipline, rather than leading or carving our own path, as the Javiers, the Halapuas, and the Tueres did when contextualizing Oceania theology. No disrespect to those who have been radical navigators and activists of Oceania biblical studies, including those of you in this forum who have managed to traverse the conservative fundamentalists of the West, as I see it. But we are still a small ika I te moana nui. As tangata whenua, we are what we call Ngāti Tūreiti. We've arrived late to the party. We have only recently surfaced in OBSA. In part, we have very few, if any, recognised biblical scholars from the institutional context. I believe there are biblical scholars sitting on the paipai or the taumata of the marae. They are cooking kai and cleaning toilets. They are digging graves and hangi pits. Our flax roots people have been engaged in studying and interpreting the biblical text since it was translated into our reo. That biblical interpretation at the flax roots level is largely absent from the institutions of biblical studies and publication. However, without people in this academic field or discipline, we as tangata whenua are at a loss to recognise that we have a place, a voice, or a silent protest here. I guess the good thing about being late to the party is that you haven't done anything hei whakamā. So we have yet to commit any great sins, let alone have any unfinished business with biblical studies in Oceania. To be honest, we as tangata whenua have had no business with biblical studies in Oceania. And in particular, from an academic perspective. Perhaps that is our greatest sin, having not engaged in the discipline or forums in any great measure. However, that is not to say that we are not engaging in biblical study and interpretation. We are simply doing it from a flax roots, ground up, native wisdom space. My mother used to always say, don't complain about something unless you are prepared to help change it. So I share my meager thoughts here with you. While we are moana people, we also need to break the surface from time to time and walk the land. I'm suggesting that we may find useful the analogy of the pā harakeke, which is a metaphor for a whānau model or approach that is rooted in the whenua. The pā harakeke is focused on the survival of the rito or the inner fronds that are protected and nurtured by the awhirito or the outer fronds, as is common in the parent-child relationship or extended whānau dynamics. I believe it is possible to replicate this relational approach for the biblical studies discipline. This approach gives emphasis to the sustainability of biblical studies in Oceania and gives weight to our multifaceted, multilingual, multidisciplined experiences. This approach requires a sharing freely of both knowledge and constructive critique. It also requires a weeding out of the colonial interventions invasions, and interruptions that keep us from valuing our flex roots biblical scholarship. I think there's probably more to explore in this quite unconventional, maybe even unacademic approach that I'm suggesting here that will require a little more work beyond this kōrero. Engari, he whakaaro noi ho, no reira ngā mihi, ngā manaakitanga kia tātai katoa.
Kia ora. Kia ora.
Sorry, Sione, that's my 2.5 cents.
Oh, that's plenty. That's plenty. Can I just ask you, for those of us who are not, our ears are not tuned to the te reo, can you explain what pa means and harakeke?
Sorry, so pa has multiple meanings. In this context. It's talking about the harakeke plants, which is the flax plant. So the rito are the inner fronds of the plant itself, and then the awhi rito are those outer fronds that protect the inside of the plant. I'm suggesting the pa harakeke really is a metaphor for whānau and for more collaborative work, particularly in the space of biblical studies. I think sometimes we hide behind the institutions that we work with and for and in, and perhaps there's the potential for us to move or relocate, at least in part, in space, but also in our thinking and in our biblical studies, to places like the pa harakeke. I'm not suggesting that we do away with the institution. I'm just simply saying that we might want to step outside for a minute or two and look at a different space, relocate to the pa harakeke.
Yeah, so malo, thank you, Te Aroha. We'll come back during Talanoa time, and I'm sure others have other questions to ask, but we'll now move on to Eseta. Eseta Mateiviti. I finally, sorry Eseta, for the last 2 weeks, I finally put on my Tongan Matematonga years, and I think I've appreciated your Mateiviti name deeper this week. So welcome, Eseta. Your turn.
Malo Sione. Well, that name, Mateiviti, means die in Fiji. It's a story about my grandfather leaving the Solomon Islands at a tender age to look for his older brothers, and did not eventually go back to the Solomon Islands. And so that's the name came about, Mateiviti, die in Fiji. And so Isambul Vinaka, and warm Pacific greetings, everybody. I would like to firstly acknowledge the land upon which I stand, those who have been before me in this space, those who have laid the foundations of this space here at St. John's, Auckland, and the many people who have traversed in this space. Just a short introduction about myself. I'm Eseta Mateiviti-Tulavu, and my grandfather left the Solomon Islands, like I said before, for Fiji in the early 1900s to search for his older brothers who got picked up by a ship whilst fishing off the shore of Sulufo in Malaita. I'm a second generation Solomonian in Fiji. I'm not a biblical scholar. I have not taught biblical studies, and this is my first time in this forum. What a privilege and an honor it is for me to be part of this forum. So I'm just one of the many voices in this platform. The topic I would like to talk more about is about the voices that matter in the future. When I think of how big the Pacific Ocean is, we also think about the rich, diverse sea life, and how our diversity is something that holds us together culturally. With diversity comes the different colors and the multitudes of voices. There are many voices out there, but I would like to highlight only 4 voices which I feel this forum needs to think seriously about. Throughout the past 2 Sundays, we have heard the different presentations and voices. But for me, one thing which stood out was the voice of women. Last week, Tolofa encouraged women's voices to be heard in this platform. But I was also encouraged by our Maori Wahine, or sister, about the need for women to rise up and take the platform like Maori Wahine. However, encouraged we may have felt throughout, there is always culture which have formed and perpetuated what society has become. So as a woman, I would like to hear more voices of other women, biblical scholars, biblical studies or not, young and old, indigenous women, women who live out in the diaspora, scholars, and more voices of ordinary women. Another voice that I felt that matters in this forum is the voice of climate change. Last week, there was a presentation about how climate change has impacted our brothers and sisters who are living in low-lying islands. We have heard how these small island nations have taken to COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference, to pose and say something about their sinking island nations, with which goals have arisen out of this conference, such as, to accelerate the phase out of coal, to curtail deforestation, to speed up the switch to electric vehicles, to encourage investment in renewable energy, protect communities and natural habitat. The question I have is, how many of these goals will be felt by people whose lives have been drastically changed because of climate change? One of the professors that I have encountered at USP, the late Professor Aotearoa, who was one of my lecturers at USP, had this to say in We Are the Ocean: Oceania is vast. Oceania is expanding. Oceania is hospitable and generous. Oceania is humanity rising from the depths of brine and regions of fire deeper still. Oceania is us. We are the sea. We are the ocean. And one of the questions I would like to ask is, how can this forum be the voice of our brothers and sisters whose home, ancestral grounds, and livelihoods are at risk because of sea level rise and climate change? Another voice that is important for me to raise in this platform is the voice of social justice of the indigenous people of West Papua. If we say that Oceania is us, what is the us doing to help our brothers and sisters of West Papua? What can this platform do? Are we doing enough? And lastly, the voice that I would like to bring up to this platform is the voice of young people. Young people's voice is an important part of what will become us, our church, and our future. This type of platform is an important space where our young people can engage with leaders who are academics, church leaders, and researchers. As we think of what our tomorrow will be like for platforms such as this, we need to be realistic about the future, and we need to bring in our young people so that we will not only learn from them, but they in turn can also learn from us. So as we look around Oceania, there are important issues and voices that always hit home to us. I understand that there are other voices, but the voices I've spoken of are important to me. And as we think of the future and biblical studies and the practical issues that we need to address, what it holds, we need to be intentional and think seriously about how this platform could be used as the voice of the voiceless. And I would, at this time, like to end with another quote from the late Professor Aotearoa. Just as the sea is an open and ever-flowing reality, so should our oceanic identity transcend all forms of insularity to become one that is openly searching, inventing, and welcoming. That's my 2 cents, Sione.
Winawalevu, Eseta. Thank you, Thomas. And we'll come back to these 4 voices that you have advocated. I'm sure there will be, well, I hope that there will be ongoing Talanoa as we continue. But we'll move now to our next speaker. Paul, welcome. Thank you.
Kia ora, Sione. Kia ora tātou. Malo, talofa, pula, kia ora tātou. I te tuatahi, tahuri te kei ki te mihi o te atua. Koe te timatanga, koe hoki te whakamutunga. Nā o nā ringa e hanga ngā mea katoa o te ao, me mihi kawana. I te tuarua, e te rangatira e Sione, tēnā koe. E ngā rangatira o Oceania Biblical Studies Association, tēnā koutou. Kia koutou katoa, tēnā koutou. I te tuatoru ko wai au, ko ōrongo te maunga, ko tākou te moana, ko ngā te rihia te hapu, ko ngā puhi te iwi, ko Paul Reynolds ahau. Kia ora everybody, it's a great pleasure to be here tonight. And first of all, I gave honour and glory to God, to our facilitator, Sione, who invited me, who I'm very thankful for, to all of those within the Oceania Biblical Studies Association, and us all here tonight. There's a bit of a theme there, I think. I follow on as well about a couple of confessions myself. I need to confess that I am not a biblical scholar. I also do not have a theological degree. What I do have, though, is 15 odd years of kaupapa Māori research, and in particular, working with whānau hapu and iwi around well-being. The other area I come with is research related to historical and intergenerational trauma. I've also worked within Te Hāhi Mihinare, the Anglican Church, the Māori Anglican Church, for over 6 years, in a lot of different roles. And currently I'm working at St. John's Theological College, and I've been here for 3 years at the end of this year. Before I start, I do want to acknowledge all of those who have spoken before and the last two Talanoa, which I found just absolutely powerful. And I also I'm also very glad to be speaking alongside my fellow panelists, Vaitusi, Aroha, and Eseta. Ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. This first slide here is the first point. I'm making 4 points. I've got 4 slides here. This is the first one, basically telling our own story, or telling our story of faith, as well as our relationship to our tupuna, to our ancestors, God, and all of creation. And I've heard this throughout the Talanoa about telling our story, and also here tonight with Te Aroha and Vaitusi and Eseta about how we tell our story. Also in the book, which was edited by Caroline Blythe and Nasili Vakuuta, The Bible and Art, Perspectives from Oceania, and Sione also had an article in there. It also tells of the importance of art in telling our story. That's why I'm talking about St. Paul's Church here. This is St. Paul's Church, Māori Anglican Church, which is in Whanganui, in Pūtiki in Whanganui, in the North Island. St. Paul's Church was one of 6 Māori churches that were constructed and designed by Sir Apiranga Ngata as part of a plan in 1926 to revive interest in carved meeting houses and also churches and also Māori artwork. As a devout Hāhi Mihinare Anglican, part of this work was also about the significance of Māori art in telling our stories of faith, of God, and also our relationship to all of creation. In 1937, St. Paul's Church was consecrated, and this was the 5th building of the church at St. Pūtiki's for a number of reasons. That year, 1937, it got consecrated. Why I raised St. Paul's Church, because as you can see within the body of the church, or within the interior of the church, It is full of toi Māori or Māori artwork, tukutuku panels, ko whaiwhai, taneko, embroidery, tapestry, just a whole host of Māori artwork. And all of it tells a story about faith. These are our illustrations of how we tell our story of how we are connected to our Creator, how we are connected to God, how we are connected to the earth, how we are connected to our whenua, how we are connected to all of creation. These stories are imparted through artwork, as in St. Paul's Church here, through karakia, through our prayer, through haka, through mōteatea, through Māori performance and art. Some of the key things I think that come out from how we share our story and how we tell our story, in particular around Māori art and also performance and also composition of waiata, of songs, of himene, of hymns and of karakia, of prayer, is that within our artwork is embedded our faith and our stories of faith. And these are our biblical stories which are embedded into this artwork, and it's an interwoven with our story of Te Ao Māori, of being Māori, of our own culture, and also with Christianity. These stories also tell the story of faith through our own lens, in our own ways. And I apologise, Matua, if I've got your name wrong, but Siose from Kiribati from last week at the Talanoa, he was talking about climate change, and he made a quote, he made a statement which I thought was hugely profound about how we as Oceanic people, as Indigenous people, talk about our relationship to the Creator. And he said, I think how painful it is for the Creator if one of our islands is wiped out from the planet, from this planet. I think that's a powerful statement. And another powerful statement aligning to that is one of our students at St. John's College, Nehana Rehana, composed a karakia, composed a prayer of forgiveness. And it was forgiveness, asking forgiveness from the earth, asking for the earth's forgiveness in response to how humans have defiled and destroyed the planet and the earth. Those two ways of framing conversations with God, with creation, with all of creation, I believe are framed in an Oceanic lens, or through an Oceanic lens, and also through a Māori lens. And within that is embedded our relationship with all of creation and the importance of that relationship. Another final thing around artwork, and there's many more things, I'm just highlighting a couple of things, is whakapapa. And there is a whakapapa connection in the creation of Māori artwork. So that's that there is a relationship, a relational connection with all that we write, all that we do, all that we compose, all that we create in artwork. For example, the expertise of carvers, the expertise of tukutuku panelists, the expertise of weavers, all of these people who are expert in craft, but they are also expert in telling a story. And they weave that story in the craft that they develop, that they compose, that they create, to tell a story to our people, to our own people. So I think the important thing there is that these are craftspeople, but they also are, you could say, as Te Aroha would say, that they are also biblical scholars. They are telling our stories of faith. They are telling our stories of the Bible. Another thing that our artwork does is about passing on the expertise of this artwork. It is a succession plan. So others come in and are trained to do this artwork, to create this artwork, to become experts. They are also trained to tell the stories. They are trained in storytelling. The way we tell our stories is in our own lenses, as in the example of Matua Whiosi talking about climate change and the pain that Creator must feel, and Neihana talking about asking for forgiveness from the earth. We frame it in a particular way and telling it through our own lens, our own language, and our own way. And that's been a common theme, I think, coming through the Talanoa. Another thing as well is that each piece of artwork, as well as the whole composition, as well as the whole church, but each individual piece of artwork tells a story. And it also has a whakapapa. It has a whakapapa to the expertise of the creator who made that piece of art. But that creation continues and that story continues with that connection with that person, but also with the connection with the story to the Bible. Finally, in relation to this, to artwork, is I also believe that this is work that is sacred, that is divine, and in service to God. In creating this artwork, we are creating it, or the creators are creating it in the presence of God. As in St. Paul's Church here in Putiki in Whanganui, the whole church is a book, the whole church is scripture, and the whole church is story and full of whakapapa. So the people present here are part of the whakapapa of this church and continue the history and the story of faith within this church, within this locality. These people are not scholars, are not biblical scholars. They are ordinary folk who pass on the stories to others, to other Māori, and to others who visit the church as tourists in order to get some money, get some funding. The next slide I want to talk about briefly is, again, others have talked about marginalisation and silences. And in particular, I mentioned Taualofa in the last Talanoa, and speakers today on our panel about communities and peoples who have been marginalised by our church, and I also want to suggest by our own. So I've made a wee list there, but a couple of points I want to say. For me, I think we need to expose these silences, the marginalisation, because to keep these silences and to keep these communities marginalised is violent. The challenge also, as I mentioned, is within ourselves and our own communities, where there is marginalising of some of our own people and some of our own communities. Another challenge is also the hijacking of our own kaupapa, of our own causes and identities by others, and the ongoing colonisation and racism that still exists in our communities and society generally. A good example of that is COVID-19, where we've seen racism, where we've seen hijacking of identity and kaupapa, in particular around Māori and tino rangatiratanga. These stories of marginalisation and silences also need to be told as part of our theological story, and also need to be acted on, I believe, as spaces of challenge, resistance, and faith. The next slide is the second to last slide is, I just want to talk about a little something that's happening at St. John's Theological College, which I think is good, and I'm so pleased it's come, but it's taken a wee while. We've stood up a new research network at the college called Te Piripoho, and that translates as Christ's embrace, and it refers to a scriptural passage which is from the Gospel of John 13:23, talking about the beloved disciple. As part of our aims for Te Piripoho, we have consciously tried to give voice to the silenced and marginalised. It has taken a while for us to get here, and it took a wee while for us to craft these two aims here. But I mean the promotion of Indigenous, Oceanic, theological voices is extremely important, but also nurturing young ones and young scholars so that they may be mentored and encouraged to write our stories. And then also highlighting those who have been marginalised. So critically examining the theologies and structures, informing the church's responses to historic abuse, historical and intergenerational trauma, exclusion and violence, including gender and sexuality, women, disability, climate change, and what we should do about it. I know a number of colleges, theological colleges and universities are concentrating on Oceanic and Indigenous studies, and in particular Laidlaw College had or has a postgraduate Indigenous theological track. Otago University and Carey Baptist College also have courses which are around Oceanic and also Indigenous and Māori theology. And Trinity Methodist College, I need to mention, is the only one in Aotearoa that has Moana studies, which actually focuses on Pacifica, Māori, Oceanic theology as a major in their Bachelor of Theology degree. As Emily mentioned, I think in the very first Talanoa, Emily Colgan, as a discipline, we have deep soul searching to do and questions to ask ourselves about how we champion marginalized voices. And finally, there are three things which I just wanted to focus on, which I think are important in telling our stories of faith and contributing toward Oceanic and Indigenous theological voice. These are just my ideas, some of my thoughts. One of them is that we come from a marginalized and a colonized and an oppressed history, and I think that history has not passed, it's still here. So I think focusing on the impacts of colonization, but also the flip side of that is about well-being. So that it's not just, it is about our recovery, our healing, and getting back our well-being as people. This area of focus is also an interdisciplinary focused work and an area. And I know there's quite a bit around trauma theology, but not much around Oceanic or Indigenous perspectives of trauma theology and theology of well-being. Another area is focusing on our own story. So a number of people, and on the panelists today too, have talked about focusing on our story. But I think actually our story needs to be told to ourselves. We talk to ourselves and writing for ourselves. And as I think it's Geraldine in the last Talanoa mentioned, using our own language, using our own terminology. And what that does, it honours our lived experience of faith, it honours our tupuna, our ancestors, and it honours God. And the final thing is about fostering, nurturing, identifying, and mentoring as much as we can those new scholars or those new students, Oceanic, Indigenous students, that we can nurture and support to encourage their writing to write more in this area. Reverend Sona Pink Martin is a Māori master's student, and she's writing around creative liturgy and worship. So about how using the Hahi Mihinari Anglican formularies and liturgy, but finding spaces where te ao Māori cultural expressions of faith can fit also. And a new faculty member at the college, Reverend Paula, is doing his PhD on the theology of kapahaka, so Māori performing arts, and making visible the theology in kapahaka. I want to finish with a couple of thoughts, just a couple of very short thoughts. My whānau, our whānau, never went to church. However, I believe we were deeply spiritual and faith-filled. My grandfather once told me, probably at a question which I asked about, Papa, why don't we go to church? And he told me that you don't need to go to church because church is inside here. It's inside our heart. You don't need a building. You don't need a church. Church is with you all the time. And to finish, I believe our faith is a lived experience. We live it every single day in everything that we do. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Paul, Malua Obito in my language. Thank you very much for bringing together not just today's panel, but for the 3 weeks you have invited us to hear the voices from the previous 2 weeks.